Hello, Imhotep, and welcome to this episode of the Egyptian Magic podcast. I'm Mog Morgan, companion of Set and Knight of Shambhala. I'm going to return to a subject of the Nephilim, having recently lectured to the Nephilim Anthropology Conference. Short thing. So some of the material might have dealt with before, but I think it's worth returning to. It's an interesting topic, and there's a kind of lot of magic in it. I've discovered it's pretty central to magic, according to some of the things I've discovered. So I think it's okay, and new things are being discovered all the time. I should say that I talked to them before about. Because the conference, they'd asked me to kind of specifically to look at Egyptian magic and Egyptian culture and see if there was any reflection there of the myth of the Nephilim that you find in the Bible, which I'm not going to go into the precise details of that. But anyway, I did that, and I thought I'd take a little bit further. Last time, I should say, I looked at its Egyptian origins. When I started out, I didn't really expect to find much, but there's actually quite a lot, right? And it enables me to say, really, we're talking about an Egyptian myth, essentially. When you're talking about the Nephilim, they may not use that precise term. It definitely has Egyptian origins and an Egyptian reverence, really. And basically, last time I talked about the Egyptian priestly historian Manetho, and I talked a little bit about some of the records found at the Temple of Horus at Edfu that seem to allude to this kind of ancient story, really. So I didn't want to repeat that. That's probably in one of the other podcasts as well, but if people say that they'd like to hear that again, I can do that. So this time I wanted to talk about new discoveries and ideas relating to the most famous monuments in Egypt, really, things like the pyramids and the Sphinx, and also the whole monument field that you find at Abydos in Upper Egypt, really, or Central Egypt, if you like. And I wanted to show how there's obviously that's quite a popular thing. Everybody likes to talk about the pyramids. It's almost if you're interested in this subject matter at all, people always want to know what your opinion is on the Sphinx and the pyramids, but I thought, but there is a connection, right? There is a way of weaving them into the story that's not too contrived. I hope you'll find. There is actually a set of illustrations that goes with this, and it should make sense just as a spoken word podcast. But if you have time, do check out the YouTube version, which has all the pictures that I'm going to look at as I go through and whatever. Anyway, as I say, anybody exploring this territory has to sort of deal with the pyramid and the Sphinx. I wanted to talk about a new discovery, though, which was specifically the Naus of the Deckards, which is a bit of a mouthful, I know, but it's an astronomical monument from Egypt that was discovered submerged, right, off the coast of Alexandria in a lost city, a city of Heraklion, which was lost in an ancient tsunami. Which I suppose you'd say that's certainly ironic, right? That given that the Nephilim myth takes us into the era of floods and myths of great floods and buried kingdoms and all the rest, that because off the coast of Egypt there really is a lost city buried beneath the ocean by a tsunami. And this monument also it's quite small. It's about the size of an average wardrobe, and it's an astronomical monument. It's a very interesting one. It's one of the first, I suppose you say, horoscopes in a way. It's really it does have a horoscope, but it's I allude to a particular astronomical time, but it's doing that as a kind of act of magic. And this thing was obviously part of there were four of them, I think, originally, and they were arranged in this kind of mandala as a piece of battle magic, and by pretty much one of Egypt's last native pharaohs who was battling against the Persians. And for a while it did sort of work, but work or not, eventually it ended up broken up by later people and thrown into the sea, or maybe at the same time. But it, as well as the astronomical data, it has cosmological data, and I think this needs emphasising because this is very orthodox. Maybe some of the other sources that we talked about in Egypt and everywhere need a lot of interpretation. They're quite sort of, especially Manetho, maybe you have to kind of work quite hard to fit it with some of these old myths and even the history of Egypt. Edfu thing takes a lot of interpretation. It's quite a complex document, but this one had the kind of quite a clear statement on it, and it's part of a temple, and it's very kind of pucker, if you like. And it says, at the beginning of finite time, i.e. the beginning of time really, as this was envisaged by the Egyptians at the beginning of time, there were four generations of disorganized gods and goddesses, and they existed before the well-known god Shu of the atmosphere raised the sky for the first time. So it's a direct reference. This is obviously part of Egyptian theology, that there was a time, before space and time actually got going, but there were entities in existence then, four generations of them, in fact, with four being a very interesting number as well, that existed in a previous, before time. You can't say a previous time because this is before time, or another time, if you like, another time and dimension. So this is the way they looked at it. They raise the sky, and the sun is able to shine and be measured across certain landscape points in Egypt. It also mentions that in the text. Very, very interesting. I thought it was also, given that I argued that the Nephilim, something to do with an Egyptian word Shebtui, the submerged ones, those who've been submerged beneath the Great Flood. Whereas the literal meaning of Nephilim, I think, is, or Nephal, is to fall down, and then by extension, giant. But to my mind, the idea of falling down and also maybe being imprisoned in the earth or under the earth is not such a stretch to that, and the idea of being submerged below the ocean, below the cosmic ocean, below the first oceans. And it's interesting how a lot of these new monuments that we're kind of interpreting and trying to weave into the story and has given us new information come from a submerged city as well, not the one in historical time, not the one from this previous age when there was some sort of cosmic battle. Essentially, that's what they're alluding to. But even so, the irony is there. So a rather extraordinary place, and colossal architecture also submerged at Heraklion. And I suppose we get used to the idea that just because that something built on a large scale is that's nothing, but it's good, it's interesting. But there's a certain element of what you might call intention to that, which we tend to overlook. It's part of the message. And it's interesting that the Sphinx itself, which we're going to talk about, the Sphinx enigma, is probably the largest piece of sculpture, or the first of the large pieces of sculpture that the Egyptians made. So there's a certain experimental quality to that, and as is well known, it's a kind of it's huge. But it's also a little bit out of proportion. It's got a kind of human head on a lion's body. And Egyptians at that stage, because it was the first attempt, hadn't quite mastered the convention of how to do that without it looking kind of strange, head too small, so they worked that out. And so usually, I know that the first question probably going through your mind, everybody's mind, is how old are the pyramids, or specifically how old is the Sphinx? Usually, people kind of approach you, like the ancient mariner or something, and they say, "Oh, are you one of these? Do you think they might be prehistoric, 10,000 years old, or built, I suppose, 8,000, 10,000 before the modern era?" I have to say I don't really follow that point of view, although I'm not disparaging of it. But I think I've found a way. The story of the Nephilim and the Egyptian equivalents kind of makes sense of why people think that might be the case, if you like. Why the Egyptians kind of did this in a way, but built this kind of enigma into all of their monuments that make them look older, or make them kind of point back to a very, very old period in their history. Anyway, you can Google and look at the image of the Nous of the Deckards. It's quite a complicated issue. Maybe and there's a lot of magic and interesting stuff in that. But there's a picture on my film, and you can find images there. But it probably needs a bit of work to make sense of this. So the pyramids and the Sphinx. I also think my view of the Sphinx, which I would probably essentially follow in the more orthodox view, that it is built by the Egyptians at the same time as the pyramids. But I don't think what I'm going to say, or what I've said before, it disenchanting in some ways, takes the magic away. I think it kind of restores the magic. It shows you where the magic really is, and how we connect that with the things that we do now, what we make of that. So I think it's more magical, but obviously we have to be aware that there was that theory about the extreme age, the pre-Egyptian origin of the Sphinx, comes famously from John Anthony West, who I think has passed over now, in 1979, in his book The Serpent of the Sky. And they pointed, he and another collaborator, they looked at the Sphinx excavation, and they said you can see from the water damage that's occurred on the side there, that when did that happen, that for some reason that points to kind of him being not Egyptian, some ancient time. Although I suppose the obvious question is, oh, how do you know it wasn't raining? When they built it, there wasn't a lot of water around. I put that to someone, and they were okay about it. They accepted that. I said, yeah, well, of course that could be true. In fact, the pyramids themselves, so I was told, they show a lot of other evidence of damage from sedimentation and water damage, if you like, the kind of salts coming out of solution and stuff, packed with salt, I was told. So, because if you look at any pictures, if you look at especially area pictures of the Sphinx, as I've pointed out a few times, you'll notice that it's not in a kind of regular oblong quarry as you would expect, a certain amount of symmetry. It's kind of a bit of a trapezoid shape, showing all the erosion and everything, and it's got this strange shape because it allows for a causeway to pass along one side to the Pyramid of Khufu. So unless you have some really weird kind of fix for a workaround for that, it looks as if the Sphinx and the pyramid behind it is built at the same time. It's sort of incorporated one within the other. So if you're going to put one back in time to a different date, to 10,000 BC or whatever it is, you're going to have to probably do that with the pyramid. And people do, in fact. They try and say that the entire pyramid complex is much older than Egypt, built by some unknown prehistoric culture, or even by aliens. It's not impossible. that's where that line of reasoning tends to lead. But I kind of suggest another thing, really, about all of this. My solution, if you like, to why there are these enigmas, undoubtedly in the site, and that's I've only mentioned one or two of them. There's the issue of, if you look at any of the famous cross sections of the Pyramid of Khufu, for instance, you'll see, which is the one you'll see famously, there are these three chambers. There's what's called the King's Chamber, where there's remains of a sarcophagus where the main burial was supposed to be. There's a lower chamber beneath that, which has been named the Queen's Chamber, but it wouldn't have been the Queen's Chamber. Queens weren't buried in the same pyramid. They had their own pyramids, satellite pyramids, if you like, nearby. Plus, it's a much smaller chamber, maybe not completely suitable for a burial in the way that the King's Chamber was. And then there's a third chamber as well, which is deep underground, almost as if they started. One idea is they started building this thing, the pyramid itself, and the underground, what was going to be the tomb. And for some reason, either they stopped and left it in this sort of half-made condition, or even that looks as maybe that's from another time as well. Maybe that really is, because it's made to look as if it is very, very older than everything else around it and whatever. Just like some of the architecture in other parts of the pyramid complex, it kind of looks different. So you can't really blame people for saying, well, how do you explain that? How would you explain the fact that it's got this bit of it that looks old? I suppose my solution essentially is that the Egyptians did it on purpose. They deliberately wanted to give it this look of antiquity, even for them. So that might sound a bit almost as arbitrary as some of the other theories, but I think when you look for that, that idea recurs in several other monuments. I'd say all other monuments, in fact, in Egypt. That there's always an archaic bit. There's always a bit where there's a kind of a bit of a mind game or puzzle taking place. So that's my solution. To kind of say that we do need. Something I talked about last time was this recent discovery on the Egypt's Red Sea coast. They found, because if you're lucky enough to go to Egypt, you might go on a tour. It used to be the old Egyptian museum, and the guys have they always take you to show you this kind of stuff from the Old Kingdom, and they show you a tiny little statue of Khufu. I mean, literally tiny, just a few centimeters high, and they say that's pretty much all there is, right? That connects this pharaoh Khufu with this Great Pyramid. There was nothing else found that really connects them together. Anyway, that situation has changed basically, and they've discovered on Egypt's Red Sea coast a harbour and all sorts of a quarry and pits, basically very like boat pits or caves in which Egyptian boats were placed for when they weren't being used in the seasons. And that architecture, in fact, of these things, which you can check online, also looks very like the boat pits that you find around the pyramids, the great colossal architecture and all the rest. But interesting as well, probably more important than the stone architecture, they found a papyrus, the oldest papyrus ever found now in Egypt, which they've called the Red Sea Papyrus. On the face of it, not the most interesting of things, but in other ways fascinating account of how these people, these mariners, Egyptian mariners, how their year went, what they were there to do, and what they did. And you know from that they worked for Khufu, and you know that part of their job was ferrying stuff across to the Sinai to get copper, but also another part of their job was working on the Nile near the Great Pyramids and ferrying the stones from the quarry at Tura to the pyramid site. So these are actually Khufu's work forces. And you also know from their records that the whole area was a natural harbour. The whole area was flooded. At some point, the Sphinx area doesn't appear to have even been made, the last thing, but certainly almost where the Sphinx is, all around that area, it was kind of higher ground, was flooded with water. And the Nile itself flowed quite close by, so could easily be diverted and extended to make a huge natural harbour around the Sphinx place at Giza, so that the workmen could live and deliver the stone that was being built, and a colossal amount of stone according to the records. I mean, almost every several stones every hour, which you would expect, of course. So I think in a way the issue of whether Khufu is connected with this pyramid and how they built the pyramid is kind of sorted now. We can almost leave that area behind. So I think my solution is saying within that historical time frame, you've still got this enigma of why then are they using, referring to a previous time, to this generation, this archaic time, even before the Egyptians were there. Why are they referring to that? And do they do it anywhere else? Okay. So, in answer to that question, do they do it somewhere else, right? Is this a pattern? Have we identified a pattern, this archaic tendency of the Egyptians? And of course, I would say the best example of that, or a very good example, actually, since I've been researching this, I've kind of found interesting examples from all over, which need to be discussed in their own right, really, because they're incredibly magical things. But just to remind you that one of the best examples of that would be the Temple of Seti the First at Abydos, of course, which is a fairly familiar monument, and you should be able to find pictures of that. Abydos was the kind of very, very early royal cemetery and for Egypt. The kings of the very first dynasties of Egypt are probably buried there. And even in later times, when people had moved the kind of royal headquarters to either to what is now the Giza area, or moved it to Luxor or whatever, they always wanted to kind of touch base, if you like, with the Abydos area, which is an incredible sacred site in the ancient world, a place of pilgrimage and all the rest. An enormous necropolis, all sorts of things there. Famously the cult center of one of Egypt's most famous gods, the god Osiris of the underworld. And indeed, the entrance to the underworld is there, in a sense, at Abydos. One of the reasons probably why they built this huge royal cemetery there is because it has this natural phenomena of a kind of cleft in the Nile escarpment, which you can see leading to the west, and then through this cleft, which has also the name Pega the Gap and all the rest, it kind of leads you into the deep desert, which is the place of the unconscious and also of the underworld. So there is this natural phenomena that obviously drew people to the area, And one of the world's masterpieces is the Temple of Seti the First at Abydos, and even though he wasn't one of the, he's a king of the New Kingdom, but there's this kind of elaborate game played in this temple, not unlike the game that's played at Giza. Uh, you've got this wonderful temple, and from studying the architecture, it becomes obvious this idea. You get this idea. They start building the temple, and at some point, the builders hit a problem. There's a problem. They have to stop building in the normal style, which is this long football field sized temple, long oblong, and all the other things. They have to stop because they find something is already there and not something that they can kind of get rid of. In a sense, they feel that they found the original tomb of the god Osiris buried there. So naturally, they can't just get rid of it. They don't want to build on top of it, which might have been one solution. So they kind of change the design of the temple and head off in another direction, head south. And they finish the temple off in the southern quarter, so they can leave this area mostly untouched. And this, of course, is the famous Osirion, or a good name for this now is the Resurrection Chamber. It's hard to underestimate how important this particular monument is, not just for Egypt, for all of us, for who are interested in magic and the esoteric tradition. Strangely, it plays a role in all of subsequent magic, not necessarily under that name, but some sort of resurrection chamber. It gives rise to the idea of alchemy directly. Alchemy starting in Egypt, connected with this object, and you can see other things I did last time about this issue of transformational images, as in the tarot, and how they kind of harp back to this particular monument, a fascinating thing in its own right, and we will explore that a lot in future times. But I just wanted to mention that it was there, and it's a kind of, it's the place where Osiris was killed, drowned. Really, it's full of water. Even though we're kind of quite a long way from the Nile when you get to Abydos, it's flooded and it's full of water and has to be pumped out regularly. The architecture is different to the New Kingdom stuff. It looks very like Old Kingdom architecture. It looks like the sort of thing you might find at the base of the pyramids. In fact, it's got all sorts, like a kind of mystery place. Obviously, some sort of mystery cult was celebrated there. It's got incredible astrological things carved onto the walls, and it's got a remarkable history. But the thing I kind of wanted to underline is that it isn't an old building. It's built at the same time as the main temple that is supposed to have changed direction. The whole thing is built as one monument. And in fact, even when they were changing the design of the main temple, they kind of block some rooms off to make it look as if the architects, we can't use that bit of masonry anymore because we've got to kind of change direction because of this thing. But this was all a game. None of that was true. It was all, as far as I know, it's all built at exactly the same moment. This archaic piece of architecture and the New Kingdom temple. So there's a second example, at least, right, of this feature of Egyptian theology, for want of a better word, is that you always have to have an archaic underground place. Underground, and this refers to an ancient times. It refers to the time of essentially of the Nephilim, or what would be called the Nephilim in the Bible, but they have another name for it, the Shebtu. It's referring to the ancient civilization, the disorganized gods and goddesses, if you like, who in the story never completely die or are destroyed in the process. They're buried or submerged by the flood, but they're not killed. Very few entities are actually killed within Egyptian mythology, but they kind of suffer, right? They're ambiguous entities as well. They've kind of got lots of good qualities, and maybe well, it says they're disorganized, so maybe they're chaotic in some ways. But the point is that they have, even though they've fallen and they've been submerged and they're under the ground, and they're referenced in many other temples as well, this underground structure, this subterranean life that you find in all Egyptian temples, they retain a certain power. In fact, they have a certain latent power that is drawn upon by the later temple itself. So that's why they're there. The later temple needs to have it there. It's like a black box, if you like, or a battery, a psychic battery maybe, or whatever. The buried entities under the temple or under the pyramid, or in connection with it, are part of the power structure of the temple itself. And resurrection chamber, this is again is connected with a very old piece of magic within Egypt, this tradition of power that can be somehow drawn upon by the living and the subsequent generations to continue the process, right? I was lucky enough to visit the Osirion in Abydos. You can't always guarantee that you'll do that. It just depends on conditions. An incredibly remarkable building whenever it was built. Even more remarkable in a way when you know that it has this history. Okay. So just to finish then, my kind of interpretation of this material, this sort of is important to the Egyptian way of looking at things, is it's not peripheral, right? It makes more sense of it, but also it brings it back to life. It makes sense of a lot of things that we do within magic, in terms of kind of referring back the fact that we kind of always build this structure, this four square structure, and something above, but also something beneath us. There's something beneath us that we kind of draw the power into us, and this is this is how magic works now. And when we work magic in this way, when we kind of think about it this way, we're closer to really understanding how the Egyptians practiced their magic. Anyway, I think that's enough to be thinking of. So whenever you do your magic, you have your four square, you have your above, below, and your center. So, Senapti, and speak to you next time.